On a map, the Strait of Hormuz looks simple enough. It appears as a thin blue line, a narrow gap between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, connecting the Persian Gulf to the wider ocean. At first glance, it doesn't look particularly special. It's just a strait. But to mistake this simplicity for a lack of complexity is to fundamentally misunderstand one of the most important waterways on Earth. Because this is not just a strait, it's a pressure valve for the global economy, a geographic bottleneck where the fate of oil markets, global trade, and even international conflict can hinge on a strip of water barely wider than a major city. And the reason why comes down to geography, the kind that looks ordinary on a map but behaves in extraordinary ways. At its narrowest point, the Strait of Hormuz is only about 33 kilometers, or roughly 21 miles, wide. That might sound wide, until you realize that the actual shipping lanes inside that corridor are far smaller. Global oil tankers traveling through the strait use two traffic lanes only about 2 miles wide each, separated by a small buffer zone. So, in practical terms, one of the most important trade routes on Earth is reduced to a pair of thin maritime highways. And through those narrow corridors flows an astonishing amount of energy. Roughly 20 million barrels of oil pass through the Strait of Hormuz every single day, representing about 1/5 of the world's oil consumption. On top of that, about 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas exports also travel through the strait. To put that in perspective, if this tiny passageway suddenly stopped functioning, the shock would ripple across the global economy within hours. Oil prices would surge, shipping routes would scramble, entire industries would feel the pressure. And yet all of that depends on a narrow waterway most people have never even thought about. To understand why the Strait of Hormuz defies geography, you have to look at where it sits. The strait forms the only maritime gateway between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, which then opens into the Arabian Sea and the wider Indian Ocean. That means every ship leaving the Persian Gulf must pass through this single corridor. And the Persian Gulf is no ordinary body of water. It is surrounded by some of the most energy-rich countries on Earth: Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Iran itself. Together, these countries produce a massive share of the world's oil and gas. But geographically, they are trapped inside a giant basin. Imagine a bathtub filled with oil exporters. Now imagine there is only one drain. That drain is the Strait of Hormuz. And because there are very few alternative routes, most of the energy produced in the Gulf has to pass through it. This is the first clue to why this place behaves differently from almost any other location on Earth. Geography has forced a huge portion of the global energy system into one narrow passage. But the real power of the Strait of Hormuz is not just its location, it's the scale of what flows through it. Every day, fleets of giant tankers pass through the strait carrying crude oil and liquefied natural gas from Gulf producers to markets around the world. About 84% of the crude oil moving through the strait ultimately goes to Asian markets, including China, India, Japan, and South Korea. In other words, the economic engines of Asia rely heavily on energy that travels through this narrow corridor. Without it, entire supply chains would be disrupted, factories could slow, fuel prices would spike, shipping networks would scramble for alternatives. And that's what makes the Strait of Hormuz unique. Its geographic footprint is tiny, but its economic footprint spans the entire planet. But here's where the story gets really interesting, because the true reason the Strait of Hormuz defies geography has less to do with trade and more to do with control. Look at a map again. On the northern side of the strait lies Iran. On the southern side lies Oman's Musandam Peninsula and the United Arab Emirates. The strait is so narrow that in some places the territorial waters of Iran and Oman actually overlap, which means ships passing through must navigate between two sovereign countries. That creates an unusual situation. The world's most important energy choke point lies directly alongside the territory of a powerful regional state, and that state is Iran. The Strait of Hormuz has been strategically important for centuries. Long before oil tankers began passing through it, the Persian Gulf was a major hub of trade between the Middle East, South Asia, and East Africa. Merchant ships carrying spices, textiles, and precious goods crossed these waters for generations. But everything changed in the 20th century, because beneath the deserts surrounding the Gulf lay vast reserves of oil. As oil production expanded across Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, and the United Arab Emirates, the Persian Gulf became the center of global energy supply, and the Strait of Hormuz became the exit point for that energy. By the late 20th century, it had become the single most important oil passageway in the world, the modern energy artery. Today, the strait handles roughly 20 to 21 million barrels of oil per day, making it the most important oil choke point on the planet. That represents roughly 20 to 30% of the world's seaborne oil trade. Even partial disruptions can cause massive ripple effects. Oil prices can surge, shipping insurance costs can spike, energy markets around the world react instantly. And because the Gulf's major oil exporters depend heavily on the strait, they are geographically tied to its stability. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Qatar, the UAE all rely on that single corridor, which means the geography of the strait effectively connects the fate of global energy markets to a tiny stretch of water between Iran and Oman. This is where Iran's geography becomes particularly significant. Iran occupies the entire northern coastline of the strait. From its shores, Iranian naval forces can monitor and potentially threaten ships passing through the corridor. Iran has long developed strategies designed specifically around this geography. These include fast attack boats, coastal missile systems, naval mines, drones, and small submarines. Because the strait is so narrow, even relatively small disruptions can affect shipping traffic. Recent geopolitical tensions have shown how quickly the situation can escalate. For example, conflicts in the region have raised fears that Iran could disrupt shipping through the strait, causing sharp swings in global oil prices. In fact, analysts have warned that the strait's narrow geography makes it particularly vulnerable during crises. And that vulnerability is precisely what gives the Strait of Hormuz its geopolitical power. So why does the Strait of Hormuz defy geography? Because it behaves like a global switch. Normally, geography distributes power. Resources spread across continents, trade routes diversify. But in this case, geography concentrates power into a single narrow corridor. A waterway barely 33 kilometers wide influences the price of fuel in cities thousands of miles away. It shapes energy security in Asia. It drives naval strategy for the United States and its allies. And it creates leverage for the countries that sit along its shores. In most places, geography limits influence, but here, geography amplifies it. So the Strait of Hormuz defies geography not because it breaks the laws of nature, but because it magnifies them. A tiny passage controls the energy lifeline of the modern world. A narrow gap between two coastlines shapes the stability of global markets. And a stretch of water that looks insignificant on a map turns out to be one of the most powerful geographic features on Earth. It's a reminder that sometimes the smallest places can have the biggest consequences. If you enjoyed learning about the geography behind global power, check out the next video exploring 10 weirdest desert cities and why they exist. Thanks for watching.